opening the center for piece development, instantly creating dynamic possibilities across the board. Instantly challenging white's central claim, the Sicilian defense creates asymmetrical pawn structures and sparks immediate strategic conflict across the board. Instantly challenging black's central grip, d4 seizes space and opens lines for rapid development, preparing an aggressive pawn storm. Opening the center with this capture immediately contests the central pawns and prepares for rapid piece development. Developing a knight towards the center offers excellent piece activity and prepares for kingside castling. Solidifying the center pawn with d6 relinquishes central space, but prepares for a flexible pawn structure against white's aggressive opening. Opening the central files, white aims for rapid development and activity, putting immediate pressure on black's pawn structure. Developing the knight to f6 challenges white's central knight and prepares for rapid castling, creating a fluid pawn structure. Developing quickly, this piece prepares to contest the center and potential tactical opportunities arising from black's pawn structure. Preparing nc6 and a fianchetto, a solid foundation for central control and potential queenside pressure. Developing the bishop to g5 here immediately pins the knight on f6, leveraging the potential for tactical disruption and indirectly influencing black's central pawn structure. It's a proactive stance, aiming to disrupt black's smooth development and create immediate pressure rather than allowing them to consolidate their position freely. This aggressive placement can force concessions or lead to awkward defensive maneuvers for black, subtly dictating the game's flow. Preparing a solid pawn structure, black fortifies their central presence and signals intentions to develop the kingside bishop, aiming for harmonious piece placement before committing to further central advances. Positioning the bishop actively on c4 now eyes the vulnerable f7 square, a classic attacking theme in this Sicilian setup, and prepares for a potential kingside initiative, while the knight on d4 remains centrally anchored. Sensing danger, black preemptively challenges the bishop's influence, creating a pawn majority on the kingside while simultaneously exposing their own king to potential future attacks. Retreating the bishop to a safe square preserves its influence on the long diagonal, maintaining pressure on black's queenside development, and preparing for potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvers that could exploit this open line. Securing the bishop's retreat and daringly expanding on the queenside, this pawn thrust ignites a fight for space, potentially forcing the attacker's hand and creating counterchances in the process. Retreating the bishop from immediate threat redirects the tension, allowing white to consolidate on the queenside while maintaining pressure on the long diagonal, subtly preparing for central pawn advances or a kingside assault later. Pushing that pawn aggressively opens up the kingside, creating a potential weakness while simultaneously gaining space. Anticipate a sharp counterattack or a positional concession depending on white's response. Recalibrating the bishop's influence after the flank pawn advance, the idea is to maintain a watchful eye on the queenside and prepare for potential piece redistribution, perhaps rerouting to the kingside or supporting a central pawn push. Suddenly, the queenside becomes a battlefield as black aggressively pushes the b-pawn, not only to gain space, but also to discomfort the white bishop and potentially open lines for a counterattack. This move injects immediate dynamism into the position, forcing white to react and question their bishop's current outpost. A bold maneuver, this knight sprints to the edge, aiming to disrupt black's advancing queenside pawns and potentially stake a claim on the d5 square if the knight retreats. Black seizes a central outpost with this knight's daring infiltration, immediately challenging white's well-placed knights and threatening to unravel the pawn structure. It's a bold gambit that injects immediate tactical tension into the game, forcing white to react decisively to prevent a potential positional collapse. The knight's advanced position creates a fork, demanding immediate attention and potentially forcing awkward exchanges that could benefit black's development. Reclaiming the pawn on e4 is a decisive centralizing maneuver, immediately challenging black's advanced knight and the pawn chain's integrity. Black seizes the opportunity to develop their bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the center and potentially exploit the kingside. This move is a direct response to white's aggressive queen sortie, opting for principled development rather than reacting purely defensively. By placing the bishop on b7, black aims to improve piece coordination and prepare for future central advances or kingside pressure, potentially setting up a queenside initiative. The bishop now eyes the important d5 square and offers potential support for pawn breaks. Unleashing the king's safety to a distant fortress, white boldly anchors their monarch on the queenside, thereby activating the rooks and creating a formidable battery along the open c-file, while simultaneously inviting black's pawn storm towards an undefended flank. Black seeks to solidify control over the d7 square, anchoring the knight for potential future maneuvers, while simultaneously preparing to challenge white's encroaching queenside presence. Unleashing the rook onto the open file, white instantly sharpens the central struggle, preparing to challenge black's vulnerable queen and potentially dominate the e-file. Emboldened by white's king venturing to the queenside, black immediately strikes at the attacking knight, forcing a decision and opening a diagonal for potential future threats. The queen's capture decisively opens lines towards black's exposed king, transforming the board into a highly tactical battleground where precise calculation will be paramount. A desperate counterthrust, the black queen plunges into the white camp, disrupting the king's sanctuary and forcing an immediate decision, a dramatic gambit to seize initiative amidst white's overwhelming central presence. This queen sacrifice, a stunning pivot, forcibly simplifies the material and redirects the game's focus towards controlling the open files, particularly the critical E file that white's rook now dominates after the recapture, presenting a stark tactical landscape where black's king feels increasingly exposed, and the positional advantage pivots towards white's active pieces. The pawn structure has become quite fragmented, and with the queens now off the board, black's king is exposed to immediate threats down the now open h-file, a serious vulnerability to exploit. The pawn thrust f3 initiates a decisive pawn chain confrontation, aiming to solidify the central pawn structure and potentially restrict black's knight activity, while simultaneously creating a weakness on e3 that might be exploited later if white mismanages their king's safety. Disrupting white's central pawn structure is the immediate aim, but this knight maneuver opens lines of attack that might prove too ambitious given the king's current exposures. The pawn structure now appears quite fractured for black, with doubled g-pawns and an isolated d-pawn, while white's king's safety is significantly improved behind a solid f-pawn shield. The castled king finds immediate refuge behind a pawn shield, anchoring the piece on the queenside and preparing for potential action in the center or on the open files. Reclaiming the diagonal for the bishop offers a potential outpost on c4, a key square that now pressures black's queenside pawn structure and eyes the vulnerable f7 square, aiming to disrupt black's defensive coordination. Opening up the center with this pawn thrust drastically alters the landscape, aiming to shatter white's central control and potentially liberate black's pieces. It's a bold attempt to inject dynamism into the position, even if it creates some pawn weaknesses down the line. Shifting the bishop to d3 aims to re-establish some diagonal influence and potentially prepare for pawn advances on the kingside. But it also leaves the e4 square a bit less guarded for the moment, which black might exploit with energetic counterplay. Seeking to activate a previously passive bishop and prepare for potential central advances, this maneuver aims to challenge white's imposing central pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. The pawn push advances, seeking to seize more territory on the kingside and potentially harass the enemy king. This aggressive advance, however, creates a significant weakness on the kingside, potentially opening lines for counterplay. White's king, currently tucked away on the queenside, might find itself safer than black's, which is now exposed to potential attacks along the newly formed open files. Careful consideration of the pawn structure and the resulting open diagonals is paramount here. A misstep could lead to a rapid collapse. Sensing an opportunity on the open file, black boldly repositions the rook, aiming to disrupt white's already precarious king's safety and potentially create mating threats along the second rank. Recentralizing the rook after its previous detour opens up lines for potential queenside action and prepares to contest the vital E file, a crucial conduit for white's attacking aspirations. The rook's repositioning aims to connect with the kingside pawns, aiming to create a more solid defensive structure while simultaneously offering support for future pawn pushes. Consider the geometric implications. This redeployment creates a more harmonized unit, with the rooks potentially coordinating on the central files. Notice how the pawn structure is becoming increasingly fractured, making the role of the rooks in defending and attacking paramount. This retreat isn't merely defensive. It's a strategic repositioning to bolster white's control over the important squares, leading towards black's vulnerable monarch. The rook's journey back to the E file underscores the positional struggle for control of open or semi-open files, a recurring theme in many chess battles. The initiative is subtly shifting as white reorganizes its forces, preparing for a more dynamic phase of the game where piece activity will be key. Relocating the king away from the central open files, this maneuver prepares for pawn advances on the queen side, potentially creating dynamic counterplay and freeing up the rook on the file. Unleashing the c-pawn is a bold gamble, aiming to disrupt black's centralized bishop and potentially crack open the queen side, though it leaves the d-pawn somewhat exposed to future skirmishes. Shifting the rook to the open c-file shores up the defense of the d-pawn while simultaneously eyeing white's somewhat exposed king, preparing for potential future pressure along that vital line. Securing the king is paramount, and shifting it to the b-file, away from the central storm and potential discovered attacks down the dark squares, offers immediate safety. Unlocking the c-file with that pawn advance creates immediate tension, forcing white's rook onto an exposed square and potentially creating attacking avenues along the newly opened path. The knight's repositioning aims to disrupt black's central control and potentially initiate an attack on the queen side. Initiating a pawn thrust to disrupt white's bishop's diagonal and contest central space, this maneuver forces white to address the immediate pressure on the f3 square, potentially opening lines of attack along the g-file or creating weaknesses in the pawn structure. Reclaiming the outpost for the bishop on c2 shores up the c3 knight's defense and prepares to contest the crucial c-file, a potential avenue for black's rook to penetrate. A strategic repositioning aims to contest the open c-file and solidify the bishop's outpost. Carving out a new pathway for the queen's rook, this maneuver aims to challenge the open file and prepare for potential queenside expansion, potentially even opening a route for the rook to the third rank to pressure black's underdeveloped pieces. The rook's aggressive sortie to the fourth rank immediately intensifies the pressure on white's queenside pawn structure, daring him to solidify or risk unraveling. Shifting the rook to the second rank aims to bolster the king's defense and potentially reroute the rook to a more active file if circumstances permit, all while preparing for a cautious advance on the queen side. Sacrificing the rook like this opens a diagonal for white's bishop and frees up black's pieces, but it's a sharp, double-edged decision. Whether it leads to a decisive advantage hinges entirely on black's ability to coordinate the remaining pieces and exploit the exposed king. Sensing an opportunity to simplify and potentially gain a material advantage, white opts for this exchange, aiming to dismantle black's central pawn structure. The immediate consequence is the opening of the rook's file, which could lead to increased pressure on the queen side or a swift transition to an endgame where white might have better piece coordination. However, black's bishop pair remains a potent weapon, and white must be vigilant against any discovered attacks or tactical lines that might emerge from the now fluid position. The king's safety will be paramount, as any misstep could leave it exposed to black's well-placed pieces. Black recaptures the bishop, a seemingly natural reaction, but this exchange dramatically alters the pawn structure and opens up critical lines for white's remaining pieces. Notice how the capture on d4 removes black's central pawn shield, potentially leaving their king more exposed down the h-file and in the long run. White's pieces are poised to exploit this newfound openness. The rook on the d-file now has more influence, and the knight on c3 can potentially jump into more active squares. Consider the long-term implications of this pawn removal. It's not just about material, but about the positional landscape that is being reshaped. Seizing the open file now, White aims to leverage the rook's placement to create threats against black's isolated pawns and potentially support a pawn advance. The rook's bold journey to the second rank immediately disrupts white's pawn structure, creating a dangerous outpost that could unravel their kingside defenses. White's bishop suddenly abandons the critical diagonal it previously defended, sacrificing positional pressure for a material advantage, though this leaves its king remarkably exposed to the lurking enemy rook. A subtle repositioning, this knight seeks to reinforce the central pawn structure and potentially eye the now exposed white king on the kingside. The exchange of queens has undeniably simplified the position, but the open g-file, which black created earlier, now presents a lingering threat that white must constantly be mindful of. By bringing the knight back into play, black aims to shore up any potential weaknesses and prepare for a more active middle game, or even an early endgame transition where pawn structure can be paramount. White's pieces, while defensively oriented, may find themselves struggling to coordinate effectively against this developing knight's potential influence. Unleashing the pawns to disrupt black's king's safety in a material-balanced but positionally complex phase, white seeks to open attacking avenues. The knight's triumphant plunge into white's kingside outpost suddenly transforms the tactical landscape, aiming to dismantle the pawn structure that once offered sanctuary. Finally, a breakthrough on the kingside as the pawns begin to cascade forward, aiming to shatter black's defensive setup. A swift retreat for the knight, seeking shelter and reorganizing its defensive potential by heading towards the central squares, away from the immediate threats and aiming to solidify black's pawn structure. The knight's jump to the queenside creates immediate pressure, threatening to snag that vulnerable pawn on e5 and simultaneously probing for weaknesses along the diagonal. Reclaiming the pawn is a natural reaction, but it surrenders the open g-file, a significant concession that allows white's king some breathing room and potentially opens lines for counterplay on the queenside later. Reclaiming the knight's central influence after the skirmish on the d-file allows white to re-establish a more dynamic pawn structure and eye the g-file's offensive potential, creating potential threats against black's uncastled king that were previously less pronounced. Bishops often find themselves misplaced after aggressive pawn storms, and this one seems particularly out of place, lacking defenders and facing a potentially open g-file soon. Reinforcing the central square and preparing to contest the open files. Pushing that pawn forward aims to disrupt white's tightly packed pieces on the queenside, seeking to create chaos and potential weaknesses in their pawn structure. Seizing the open, a file is a priority now, aiming to disrupt black's currently solid pawn structure and potentially create infiltration possibilities. The rook, liberated from its flank and now fully active on the open rank, orchestrates a beautiful sequence designed to dismantle the opposition's defensive structure and expose their monarch. Dislodging the menacing rook from the open file forces the white king to a slightly more exposed square. Reactivating the bishop on g7 to participate in the kingside fray, after the knight's redeployment, opens up interesting possibilities. The monarch, seeking to escape the looming threats on the kingside and centralize, now pivots toward the queenside. Unleashing the knight to c6 immediately activates a piece, placing it centrally and eyeing potential outposts while offering defensive support to the pawn chain. The knight's repositioning to b3 aims to activate it for potential queenside threats, eyeing squares like c5 or a5, while also defending the critical d4 pawn that was just recaptured. The opening of the e-file presents a vital opportunity to activate the queen's bishop, potentially influencing the center and creating counterplay against white's otherwise solid pawn structure. Snatching the pawn opens a vital diagonal for the queen and creates immediate pressure along the queenside, but it also leaves white's king exposed and could invite counterplay from black's coordinated pieces. Seeking to reroute the knight to a more active square, the black knight endeavors to reach the crucial central squares, potentially disrupting white's bishop pair and creating new attacking avenues. Safeguarding the king's newly acquired safe haven on h5 presents a crucial defensive task, diverting resources from any potential queenside counterplay and aiming to shore up the position before the opponent's energetic knight can infiltrate further. Focusing on the inactive bishop, the player aims to activate it by bringing it to a more central square, potentially supporting an eventual d4 pawn advance or even finding a path towards the queenside. Disrupting the enemy's king's safety with a swift check forces a concession, aiming to simplify into a winning endgame. Stepping the king back to c8 is a pragmatic choice, aiming to untangle the monarch from the active rook on b4 and re-establish a safer, more centralized position, although it does concede some potentially valuable central squares and delays any attempt to contest the open files. Exploiting the newly opened queenside diagonal, the knight maneuvers to a promising outposting square, ready to disrupt black's pawn structure and launch a direct assault on the king's weakened defenses. Unlocking the knight's potential is paramount now. Repositioning it to a more active square, perhaps e6, offers a better chance to disrupt white's pieces and potentially create counterplay. Activating the queenside pawns to create a passed pawn on the b-file offers a promising avenue for queenside expansion and potential endgame advantage. The rook's repositioning to the 5th rank opens up fascinating possibilities for disrupting white's centralized king and creating mating threats.